Well, this is Pastor Bill from Faith Baptist Church. Once again, we had a little bit of a snafu on Sunday when we were live streaming. We had the internet to go out in the midst of the message, and so we're having to record it fresh so that it can be put up on YouTube later on today. I want to encourage you, if you have your Bibles, to grab hold of them and turn to Revelation chapter 18. We're going to be looking at verses 9 through 19 today. I wonder how many of you have ever thrown a pebble into the water and you notice those ripples that begin to go out from that pebble. Now, how far they went really depended upon the size of the body of water that you threw it into. We actually don't know how far these ripples continue to go, say if you threw it in the ocean. But we do know that from the point of impact, ripples begin to flow out. So I'm calling the message today the ripple effect, because we're going to be looking at a passage where we're talking about the effects of the fall of Babylon the Great on three different groups of people. And we'll talk about those in just a moment. Nothing happens in a vacuum. You've probably heard that before. That's actually a quote from a gentleman by the name of Khaled Hosseini. He said, every action has a series of consequences, and sometimes it takes a long time to fully understand the consequences of your actions. Well, in this incident that we're going to be looking at today, the consequences were immediate. Now, the fall of Babylon seems to have taken a while, and it hasn't happened yet. Although I'm convinced that it's already in process, that the fall of Babylon is already happening. Nearly 45 years ago, during the 139th meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Edward Lorenz posed a question. He asked the question, does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? In our passage today, we're probably going to see something kind of like that taking place. The first point that I want us to look at today is what you hate really reveals what you love. The earth dwellers that are mentioned in Revelation are those who live for the priorities and the values of this world. Now, you go back and remember what John said in 1 John 2:15 about this world. He said, don't love the world or the things of the world, because these are passing away. And people who, these earth dwellers, hate God. They love the world system that is represented by the prostitute or Babylon the Great. And they're consumed by greed, by self-interest. They're narcissistic because their desires and their passions and everything just consume them. And their worldview is centered around self. Their conversation is peppered with I, me, and my, and mine. Isn't it interesting that many times the first word that a child learns is mine, and they use that over and over and over again because everything really does center around that child, to that child. Let's look at verses 9 and 10 just for a few moments. The kings of the earth, or the politicians who lead the pagan lands, the kings of the earth, who have committed sexual immorality, which is idolatry, and shared her sensual and excessive ways, will weep and mourn over her when they see the smoke from her burning. And these kings are political leaders of pagan nations. They get their power from the Antichrist, and they mourn because they see the center of power, the source of their power, the empire of Antichrist, crumbling and falling. Everything they've counted on and everything they've placed their faith in is burning. Consequently, they sob openly in their despair. They're those who love the world and the things of the world, and they're going to be devastated when Babylon falls. They have backed the wrong party. These are monarchs. These are political leaders, and they've backed the wrong party. The end result is their eternal doom. Verse 10 tells us they will stand far off in fear of her torment. And the reason they're in fear is because they know that that's what's going to happen to them, what they see happening to Babylon. And so they're saying, whoa, 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 the great city, Babylon, the mighty city, for in a single hour your judgment has come. The judgment of God comes not like a hurricane. You know, we begin to track a hurricane when it leaves the the coast of Africa and it comes all the way across the ocean. We track it all the way, and we have many, many days usually to prepare, to buy the essentials we need to buy, to board up windows if necessary, and all this kind of stuff. The judgment of God is not going to be like that. It's going to be instantaneous. It's going to come quickly. If you've ever been in an earthquake, it will be more like an earthquake than like a hurricane. Hurricane has lots of warning. An earthquake has no warning. Just suddenly, the earth begins to vibrate and quake and to split open. We have had multiple warnings already about the judgment of God, all the way through the Bible. And we've seen God bring judgment on his people time after time after time. It hasn't been final judgment, but it's been judgment based on their disobedience. And we've seen that happen over and over again. And yet we really haven't taken note of the fact that it is sure, it is coming, and it's going to happen in a hurry. The second point I want us to look at is found in verses 11 through 17. James Carville, who was a political strategist in Bill Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign, he coined the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid." As I've said many times, I really believe that the thing that will eventually bring America to her knees is failure of the economy. We're experiencing some of that right now. Business owners, especially small business owners, who are not able to ply their trade, if you will, and sell their goods because of the coronavirus. And then others who are experiencing the loss of their businesses because of the violent protests that have been going on due to the racial unrest in America. One of the interesting things that I've noticed in politics is oftentimes people vote their pocketbook. What I mean by that is whichever candidate or party promises them the most money is the party that's going to get their vote. In verses 11 through 13, we find that this was true, or is true, when Babylon falls. The second group of people, first group were the monarchs. The second group of people we're going to talk about are the merchants of the earth. And it speaks of them here in verse 11 through 13. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargo any longer. Cargo of gold, silver, and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet, all kinds of fragrant wood products, objects of ivory, objects of expensive wood, brass, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh and frankincense, wine, olive oil, fine flour and grain, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages and slaves, human lives. Now, as we look at those, we think, well, you know, that was then, this is now. Let's just back up just a moment and think about where these different things come from. The silver, the gold, the pearls, all these things, they come from the jewelry store. Then the different articles of clothing come from the clothing store. From the furniture store comes these things that have been built from wood, the wood products. From the interior decorator shop come the things that you use to enhance your home. From the perfumery or a place that sells cologne and perfume and all of these sweet smelling things, that's talks about some of the incense, the myrrh, and the frankincense that it's talking about here. From the grocery store, the food, the things that are grown. From the animal sales barn, where I used to live, there was a sales barn down at the end of the road, and every Saturday, all the farmers would come in, they'd bring their livestock, and they would auction off their livestock. And they might come with one kind of livestock and auction it off, but they might, in the process, buy another and take it back with them. And then the last one is the slave markets. And you know that we're facing a time in our day where human trafficking is a big deal. It's not the same kind of slavery that caused the Civil War or brought about all of that, but it is a slavery nonetheless. Way back in the book of Ezekiel, hundreds of years before what John wrote here, Ezekiel mentioned 15 of these 29 commodities in chapter 27 of Ezekiel. And he warned Jerusalem concerning their impending exile to Babylon. John is warning the world, the whole world and the world system, about the impending judgment of God that is coming. Someone has said, the more things change, the more they remain the same. So from Ezekiel's day to John's day to our day, things are just about the same as they were. People have said that if you don't learn from history, you are doomed to repeat it. As a youth pastor, I used to ask my students every once in a while, which would you rather have, $1 million or God to meet all of your needs? Well, kids being kids, they almost always chose the $1 million because they wanted to have that money in hand. They wanted to be able to handle that themselves and decide what they would do with their money. But the reality is many adults are the same way. We want it now. We don't want to have to depend on God on a daily basis or a weekly basis or monthly or yearly basis to meet our needs. So we're not much different from these kids. Every day the newscast, if you notice, ends with a look at the direction of the Dow Jones average. If it's up, then they feel like, oh, things are getting better. The coronavirus is not as much of a problem as we thought it was. The protests are not as much of a problem as we thought they were, because the Wall Street wizards are saying that things are going to be better. Well, the truth of the matter is we cannot judge the future on the basis of our pocketbook. In verses 14 through 17a, the angel continued his warning. He said, the fruit you craved has left you. All your splendid and glamorous things are gone. They will never find them again. The merchants of these things who became rich from her, Babylon, the system of evil in the world, will stand far off in fear of her torment, just like the monarchs stood way off and they wept and they mourned. And these merchants are saying the same thing. Woe, woe, the great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, jewels, and pearls, for in a single hour, such fabulous wealth was destroyed. While here we see the kings, the merchants, and later we'll see the mariners all lamenting the fall of Babylon. In our days, it's the Wall Street wizards, the mall owners, and the shop owners, and the small business people, and the CEOs of great companies. They and as well as those who transport goods, the truckers in our day. Back in that day, it was more by water that goods were transported from one place to another. I often walk in the Lakeshore Mall when it's too hot, or to walk outdoors, or when it's raining or something like that. And I pass more spaces that are closed than are occupied these days. As a matter of fact, last week I counted 33 places that were closed and 22 that were open. And that's not counting the kiosk. It's only a matter of time before these mall owners will have to close the entire mall because they're losing money. And we're going to be like the merchants. We're going to begin to lose our income because things are not going the way they should. Those of us who are depending upon an annual fee that comes from our work, from our Social Security or an annuity or something of that basis, might find that begin to grow smaller because the market is not what it has been in the past. So we might find ourselves with those people who were merchants, who stand back and cry out because of the fall of Babylon. The third thing that I want us to look at today is found in verses 17b through 19, and it's talking about going down with the ship. The last group who laments the fall of Babylon the Great are the mariners. And they're made up of every shipmaster, seafarer, the sailors, and all who do business by sea. And again, they stand afar off. They're afraid to even get close as they watch the smoke from her burning, and they kept crying out, "Woe, woe, who was like the great city?" They threw dust in their heads. That's what they used to do in the ancient days. It was an expression of grief. And they kept crying out, weeping and mourning. The great city where all those who have ships on the sea became rich with her from her wealth, for in a single hour she was destroyed. Now, we keep hearing that phrase, in a single hour. That's not talking about 60 minutes. It doesn't mean that the judgment of God is going to take 1 hour. It means it's going to take a short time, because in the span of things, an hour is not very long. An hour of your life. It seems long while you're in that hour, but when you look back at the hours that have already passed, you realize it's just a drop in the bucket. Pastor David Platt, who used to be the president of the International Mission Board, has said, if you love this world, it will pass away and it will take you with it. You will not only lose true pleasure, you'll lose your life, and you will perish with the world. The idea of a captain going down with his ship is a maritime tradition that some countries have actually made into law. And if you happen to be the captain of a ship from one of these countries, then and something happens to the ship begins to sink, you are supposed to stay on the ship and go down with it. Perhaps the most famous captain who did this was the captain of the Titanic, Captain Edward Smith. The real story is that he was sleeping off and drunk when they hit the iceberg. And when he was awakened and realized what was happening, he made the decision to go down with the ship, I guess, rather than face the fact that he was not at his post as he should have been, but was sleeping off a drinking bout during that time. Well, in a lot same way, the maritime merchants at the time of the fall of Babylon the Great, they're drunk with their riches and their success, and they're thinking, they're kind of like the farmer in the New Testament that said, wow, my crops are coming in and my barns are full, and what am I going to do? And then he says, I know what I'll do. I'll tear down these barns and I'll build bigger barns, and then I'll fill all of these barns, and I will say, eat, drink, and be merry. I don't have anything to worry about at this point. Well, these maritime folk, they have had a great business delivering all of the goods to the merchants, who in turn sell them to the people. And all of a sudden, the ripple effect begins to grab them. As the ship goes down, it takes them with them. The idea of our being destroyed with the world system is an idea that you and I don't like. But we have to recognize it's a lot like what Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 24, when he said, when that day comes, when the day of judgment comes, when the moment comes, if you happen to be on the top floor of your house or the roof of your house, you're not going to have time to run down one floor and get a jacket. You're going to have to get out of there. If we have tied our lives to the way of the world, then we will perish when the way of the world perishes at the judgment. Well, that's the final effect. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11:28, when he was talking about the Lord's Supper, that a person needed to examine themselves to see that they were not unworthy of taking of the Lord's Supper. He said some people who had not done this had become sick, and some had even died because they did not examine themselves and know if there was unconfessed, unrepented sin in their lives. If we are tied in to the world system, sometimes we get to the point where we don't recognize it, but we need to pause and examine ourselves and see, how dependent am I upon the world system, and how dependent am I upon God? We need to make sure we're aligned with God. If we're not, we need to confess that as sin, and we need to repent, turn, go in a different direction, turn away from self and sin, and turn to God and the assurance that he gives us that if we surrender our lives to him, he will prepare for us a place that we'll live with him where we'll live with him eternally. And the way you do that is you just pray a very simple prayer. Jesus, I give you my life. That's surrender. And I like to do that with my palms up, showing that I'm relinquishing everything. If you've never done that, I'd like to encourage you to do that today, wherever you might be. Sitting on your couch, in your easy chair, or if you're sitting on a church pew somewhere, I'd like for you to consider the fact that if you've never surrendered your life to Christ, you must do that in order to align yourself with the will of God and remove yourself from the tentacles of the evil world system. That's your only hope. Now, if you have surrendered your life to Christ, but at some point you've begun to take back control, you begin to pull things back, you need to acknowledge the fact that that is sin. You won't lose your salvation, but you'll lose the joy of your salvation, and you'll lose some of your eternal reward that God prepares for you, because what you'll bring to the Lord then, because you're hanging on to things, will be wood, hay, and stubble, and that's going to burn up. Instead of bringing to him those things that you've surrendered that turn into gold and silver and precious stones. And those are going to be purified at the time. Confess your sin to God. He is rich in mercy, and he will forgive your sin, and he will make you righteous. Again, don't be caught in the ripple effect. I'm told that if a ship is sinking and you happen to be where the water is rushing into the ship as it begins to sink, you will be taken by that gush of water that comes in all the way to the bottom of the ship. That's what happened to many of the people on the Titanic. And the plea to you today is that you don't assume that everything is all right. You examine yourself, and you do what God, by his Holy Spirit, makes you aware you need to do. Either surrender your life to Christ, Lord Jesus, I give you my life, or confess your sin and ask God to please cleanse you from all unrighteousness and restore the joy of your salvation. That's what David prayed. God bless you. Have a wonderful day. And I pray that you are not a part of the evil world system.